Greetings comrades, my name is Gigantles, and in this video there's two things I'm going to discuss. So firstly, I've still got the ant problem. It's really irritating. I've brought glue traps and poison and double-sided tape and everything to try and stop them crawling all over my floors and walls and trying to colonize my plants. I'm going to be really irritated if they do that. It's all come with limited success. The glue traps have caught only one ant so far out of all three of them. This double-sided tape has only slowed them down and discouraged them mostly, but I still see them trying to walk over it sometimes. And the poison traps haven't seemed to even attracted any ant in the first place. So, mixed success. The only real solution I see that's had some sort of some sort of success, is me flooding the area around my pot plants because ants can't swim. But I'm concerned they may, that constant state of keeping my plant, the bottom of my pot plants wet, will result in a constant saturation of the soil in my pots, which will lead to root rot. So I've got to be careful about that. If any of you have any tips on how to deal with ants without damaging the roots of plants, please let me know. I'd really appreciate it. My arm is shaking. Anyway, the second part of this video, on a more serious note, is about a recent tweet going around about Elon Musk's proposed points for a Russian-Ukrainian peace. And he's received a lot of criticism for this because despite him giving all the Starlink satellites to Ukraine, no, not Starlink satellites, just I can't remember what it is now, but something about Starlink, in order to ensure that the Ukrainians had access to the internet. Despite him giving all of that at a loss of like 58 million for his company, he's been branded as pro-Russian because of 4 points that he's said to try and propose a peace between Russia and Ukraine. And I think it's unfair to criticize him as pro-Russian when we need to look at his points from the larger perspective and see what sort of conclusion he's proposing. So his 4 points are, what were they? There were the removal of Russian troops of Ukraine, the return of Crimea to Russia, since Russia owned Crimea for most of its history, until fairly recently, historically speaking. Referendums run by the UN held in the Donetsk and Luhansk republics to determine whether or not they do want to become part of Ukraine or Russia. And Ukraine remains a neutral country, so it doesn't join NATO. And I think we need to look at his points in the bigger context here, what he's trying to achieve. Because I know the West has pretty much a sort of fantasy about what they want from the Russian-Ukrainian war in terms of the outcomes. And that outcome pretty much goes along the lines of Ukrainians reach the Russian borders and retake Crimea, the Putin regime collapses, some more friendly guy takes over, and the Russian-Ukrainian war is finished. But I think we need to look at the more realistic side of things here. There's no guarantee that when Ukrainian troops reach the Russian-Ukrainian border, that this war will suddenly magically be over, or that a coup in Russia will be successful, or even that Putin's successor may be better than him. Honestly, I think that, and I know I said that I want Ukraine to win this war. Sorry, I'll hold my phone with two hands since it's shaking. Don't know why my arms are so tight. I know that we want Ukraine to win this war and reclaim all of its territories, but in the bigger picture, it's not going to be as simple as reaching the Russian border and then that's the end of it. I think that when they reach the Russian border, they're going to have to maintain a constant military presence in the east. Because, and I have looked at the Ukrainian war map, and from what I've seen, the Russians have been trying to retake the north of Kharkiv again, not from their occupied territories, but from Russia itself. And so even if Ukraine does reach the border, these skirmishes along their northern and eastern borders with Russia could go on for potentially decades. Which means Ukraine is going to have to constantly rely on the West for support in securing its northern and eastern borders, and that's if Belarus doesn't get involved either. In which, if that happens, then there's going to be a massive escalation. I also don't think that is it really worth a collapse of the Putin regime if his successor could be even worse than him? I'm not trying to say Putin must be in power, but there is that risk. There is that risk that his successor may be even worse and resort to the escalation of the war with nuclear weapons. And in the bigger picture, when you look at Elon Musk's proposed plan, you see that out of all the potential outcomes, it's probably the one that would save the most lives. I'm not saying that means it must be followed necessarily. Okay, one hand now. Just hear me out, okay? What Elon Musk is trying to propose here, we need to look at all four of his points individually. So remember, this whole situation was started because Ukraine wanted to join NATO. Now I can understand why, because Russia was bullying Ukraine and stole Crimea from them. Okay, I fully understand why Ukraine wanted to join NATO to maintain its territorial integrity. But there's already tensions with the Baltic states being NATO countries, and so if Ukraine didn't become a NATO country, then or even express a desire to become a NATO country, then it's very much likely that this recent Russian-Ukrainian crisis in the overall war between the two countries wouldn't have happened. Moving on to the return of Crimea to Russia. Honestly, I don't know how well that would work, because it means that Crimea, with control of Crimea, Russia could very easily just block all the ports from Ukraine and bully the country more in future. But maybe there could be a situation like in Israel with the Golan Heights, in which the UN maintains the border between Israel and Syria. So there's a constant UN presence there to stop any sort of escalation of fighting. And this actually leads quite well into the UN-run referendums held in Donetsk and Luhansk, because there's something we need to see here, that even if Ukraine reclaims all of its territories in Crimea and Luhansk and Donetsk, it wasn't just the Russian presence or the Russian invasion that was causing problems there. It was the separatist rebels there. They were the ones who'd been fighting for almost a decade or even decades, saying that we want to be a part of Russia. And even if Ukraine retakes those territories, there'll be a constant thorn in its side. Remember, when Russia took places like Kherson, they tried to begin the immediate Russification of those oblasts, which means that they tried to convince everyone there that they were Russian by eroding at their Ukrainian identity. And when it comes to establishing I can't think of the right word here. When it comes to establishing your nationality over someone else's in a territory you recently annexed or took control of, that's what you need to do to basically create some sense of stability there. You need to go in there and tell everyone, look, you're no longer part of your previous country, you're part of us now. And if Ukraine is going to convince Crimea, Luhansk and Donetsk that they are Ukrainian instead of Russian, they're going to have to spend billions a year on doing so. With Russia in Kherson, they were handing out Russian passports. They were trying to convince everyone to drop the Ukrainian currency and adopt the Russian ruble. But this is the thing here. Is Ukraine willing to spend billions on 3 oblasts, Crimea, Sevastopol, I think, whether before then? Okay, I'll just count it all as Crimea. Would Ukraine be willing to spend billions a year trying to convince 3 majority Russian or strongly influenced three strongly Russian populated oblasts, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea, that they are Russian? That they are Ukrainian. Would it be willing to convince them, try and convince them for potentially decades until finally they start saying, okay, yes, we are Ukrainian? But throughout that entire process, there's no guarantee that it will even be successful. When the Romans took over when the Romans took over their neighbors on the Italian peninsula, that took decades to convince them, look, you are not just Etruscan or Gaul or whatever other place you're from, you are Roman, you speak Latin, you worship our gods, and so on. Okay, that took... So why am I suck at speaking, sorry. That took ages. And can Ukraine afford to do that with Russia constantly overshadowing them from the east, and maybe even maybe even starting another conflict in future, saying you're trying to erode at the Russian nationality or identity of these people, how dare you do that, this is cultural genocide or whatever. Can Ukraine afford to convert these Russian influenced oblasts to think that they're Ukrainian, with Russia trying to do the exact opposite against them, and even threatening to invade if they continue? Because if that is the case, it may just be better to get rid of those Russian influenced oblasts and stop all potential conflicts. On the other hand, this could very easily be seen as a repeat of Czechoslovakia in 1938, in which Hitler convinced Britain and France to divide up Czechoslovakia and give the territories where the Poles were to the Poland, where the Germans were to Germany, and so on, and eventually led to the invasion of what was left of Czechoslovakia by Germany, and providing escalation into World War II. So that would be a very nasty repeat of history. And effectively the appeasement of the Russian dictator. And appeasement proved itself to not work out too well prior to World War II. So it's a really difficult situation here. Elon Musk's proposal, theoretically, could be the most peaceful. It could save hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian and Russian lives, both in this current conflict and also by preventing the Russian state from collapsing completely, and whatever revolution or civil war that follows over who will be Putin's successor. But we need to ask ourselves here, would we be willing to support an outcome to this war that could result in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and Russians, the collapse of the Russian state, the higher potential of a nuclear war from an even worse dictator than Putin, and continued unrest between Ukraine and Russia for decades to come, over a more peaceful conclusion where, despite it sounding like the appeasement policy from the 1930s in Europe, could save hundreds of thousands of lives and potentially provide a more stable situation for Ukraine and Russia, whilst not endangering hundreds of millions of lives around the world with a lack of access to Ukrainian grain and Russian oil and gas and so on. It shows that politics and war here, they're really not as simple as, okay, we must fight to win. There's massive implications beyond that, and it's one of the reasons why I try and follow this war so closely, so I can try and understand the situation as much as I can. Because the more factors in this war you take into account, the better chance that you can come up with a solution that's more realistic. And it's really hard to try and see how this war here could end with... I know I said I don't see World War III as a possibility really here, or at least a very unlikely possibility, but it's hard to imagine how this war could have a proper conclusion, one that results in Ukraine being left alone, unless Elon Musk's points are being followed. That doesn't mean I think they should. That doesn't mean I say, okay, Russia and Ukraine. Sorry, my hand's shaking again. That doesn't mean I think that we should adopt that plan as our sole strategy when it comes to potential negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. No. But I think that we need to see the purpose of Elon Musk's plan in the bigger picture and not just criticize him because he talks about surrendering some of Ukraine's territories to Russia. We need to look at the bigger picture here, and even if we disagree with him, we should still be willing to listen to him. Okay, that's how it works in a civilized country. You can agree with someone, so you can agree or disagree with someone without necessarily supporting their points. You can listen. We should listen to them at least. We should try and understand where he's coming from, or where people that we disagree with are coming from, to see if maybe there's other things we're missing. And for all we know, maybe Elon Musk a couple of months from now will say, okay, you know what, ignore what I said a couple of months ago. I've seen how things have developed in Ukraine, and it's clear that I didn't take into account several factors that I know of now, and I know that my plan isn't going to work. Okay, in that case, we shouldn't try and lord it over him or say I told you so, because ultimately we are all learning. And I said myself that I have faith that there are other factors out there which will result in us not having a nuclear war. But even then, in my scenarios over what could happen in Russia, that would still result in the deaths of potentially hundreds of thousands of Russians. And it's a difficult situation. Would I support a collapse of the Russian state and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Russians over instead of a nuclear war, or even just a single tactical nuclear strike in Ukraine? It's a difficult question to answer, because hundreds of thousands will die on either side, and escalations can't be predicted properly. We don't know we don't know how either outcome will affect the war in its entirety or global politics. Which is why I ask that you all please pray for an end to this war by just the most peaceful solution possible. Maybe there's an even more peaceful solution that results in as few deaths as possible that Elon Musk doesn't know about. And I ask that you please pray for all politicians in general, because some of them have to deal with these questions on a more frequent basis than us. It's just that only now we are being made of the gravity of the situation that they have to deal with. And maybe it's even worse than we thought, and they're really struggling to come up with a solution, hence their apparent indecisiveness. So just please pray that some way of peace can be achieved, and not just in the short term, but in the long term too. Also pray that as few lives as possible will be killed, and as many as possible will be spared, because in the end, life is a life. Even if you are at war with a country, those are still civilian lives being killed, and those soldiers who we consider our enemy, they are still husbands and fathers and sons and grandchildren. They're still all individual lives, and there are people who want them to return home. War is a horrible thing. It really is. So just please, and sorry I'm repeating myself here, but just please pray for an end to this war, one that is the right balance of establishing a long-term peace as well as saving as many lives as possible. But again, I'm sorry for ranting here. You can disagree with me, okay? You can, but don't hate me for it. Don't think I support everything Elon Musk says, because I don't. I just want to understand where he's coming from, and I want you to understand where he's coming from, so we don't criticize him without at least understanding what he's trying to say. Okay, you can understand what someone's trying to say, but still disagree with them. Otherwise, please pray for this war to be finished. Have a good week, all of you. God bless you all. See you in the next video, comrades. Until then.